station. This is Houston. Are you ready for the event?
Houston, this is station. We are ready for the event.
KZSU Radio, this is Mission Control Houston. Please call station for a voice check.
Check, check, check. 1, 2, 3.
Hey, I've got you loud and clear from the International Space Station.
Good morning, Dr. Rubins.
Hey, how are you? It's very nice to talk to you.
Very nice to talk to you, and thank you for joining us. Could you tell us, where are you in the space station right now? What is this we're looking at?
Yeah, so I'm in the U.S. laboratory. This is just about the center forward part of the space station. And as you can tell, it's absolutely a working laboratory. We have experiments all over the place. That's really what we spend a lot of time on in microgravity, is doing all kinds of scientific experiments. And so the different thing about this laboratory is, instead of just having experiments on the benches, you have it on the walls and the ceiling as well. You can see that everywhere.
Absolutely. So what will you be doing today? Is this a typical day for you, and what does a typical day consist of?
Yeah, a typical day in space is pretty much anything and everything. I'm going to be doing an experiment right after we finish chatting, actually, to try to understand how fluids move around in tubes up here. So one of the really fascinating things in microgravity is that fluids are no longer subjected to the force of gravity pulling them down. So they form balls, they float, and we do have things like surface tension that still take over as dominant variables. And so we're going to take a look at some modern molecular biology tools and try to understand how fluids are behaving in this weightless environment.
I see. I see. We're very interested in the experiments that you've been conducting and the science that goes on. I wonder if we could just get a little bit of information from you about your own path to becoming an astronaut. Your training was in microbiology. What motivated you to pursue astronaut training?
Yeah, so it's, I always say that astronaut training is not something that you find. It's, are you just lucky enough eventually to be chosen for this? There's a lot of people that want to do this job, and it's a little bit, I think, like winning the lottery some days to get the chance to leave the planet. I have always wanted to be a scientist, and I was pretty solidly working towards that as a career. Did my graduate studies at Stanford and then had a lab at the Whitehead Institute at MIT, and decided to apply for astronaut applications because it was something I wanted to do ever since I was a small child, but doesn't really seem to fit in that completely realistic career possibility path. I think the lesson is take a chance and see what you can find. You never know where you're going to end up.
Right. So you've been in space now 3 months. We're wondering, what has been easier than you expected, and what has been harder than you expected?
So it actually was a lot harder when I first got up here, just to learn how to move around and stabilize yourself. The mission control folks kind of joke when you get new astronauts on board that they end up crawling on the floor of the space station. And I thought, well, I'm not going to be a crawler. And it turns out in your first few weeks, you cannot move yourself from one place to the other because the space station is in free fall. You're in free fall. This is not something that you've ever had in your human experience, and it's a little bit like learning how to walk again. You end up at some point you get pretty good motion control. So I can control now with my fingertips. So I can float here. I'm sitting in the middle of the module, or I use my feet a lot to move myself around. You end up being like you're kind of hanging around sometimes from tree branch, and we're learning how to do all of that. So that was harder. Some of the things that have been easier than expected were a lot of the things that we've been just training for years. So things like robotic operations and EVA, all of our science experiments, none of those are easy, but they are familiar territory. I think it's something that NASA in preparing the astronauts how to train and how to fly.
Right. So let's talk about one of those experiments, which really was a milestone. For the first time, you successfully sequenced DNA in a spacecraft. So 2 questions. One, why is it so difficult to do that, and why has it taken this long to do it? And what are the implications of being able to do it? Why is that important?
Yeah, there's a couple reasons that this is really critical. One is that we're testing out the ability to do really remote science, and I mean really remote. We're off the planet. This is important actually for Earth. I used to work in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I worked on monkeypox and also spent a number of years working on Ebola. We've had outbreaks of both of these diseases. The ability to rapidly determine viral sequence in a setting where you have no power grid, almost no internet communication, no infrastructure whatsoever. If you can overcome those kinds of engineering challenges in order to send something to the space station, it is very adaptable to these sorts of remote locations on the planet. The other reason we want to start doing that is to understand how sequencing works off the planet. And I mentioned about fluids behaving. They behave in very unexpected ways up here. Just basic things like pushing fluid out of a drink bag will be an amazing property that I have never seen liquids behave in that way on Earth. So it's not completely well understood how the liquids were going to behave in a fluidic system needed for sequencing. It's also not completely understood if this was even going to work at all. It's actually a pretty complex set of experiments to get this up here and then to get the data back down to Earth. So we have proven that we can use this technology in microgravity. Now, really, the world of sequencing and molecular biology is opened up to us on the space station. So we can use this to do real-time analysis of things like the microbiome on the space station, cellular function and structure in orbit. You can imagine if cells are in free fall, rather than sitting at the bottom of a plastic dish, their function may be greatly affected, their structure may be affected. We can study all of those types of things with modern molecular biology tools. The first thing is you have to show that this can work off the planet.
Thank you. Now, in August, you conducted your first spacewalk. Is there any possible way that you can try to help our listener appreciate what that experience is like?
That's pretty hard because I didn't even have a very good understanding of that myself before I went out the door. And I worked at NASA and trained in a giant pool underwater for 7 years first. So it is, I would say, more awesome, amazing, and terrifying than you can possibly imagine to be in the vacuum of space in a spacesuit. The incredible thing I actually found was that our spacesuits function like their own spacecraft, and they have systems that report to us. We have teams of folks on the ground that are watching you in your spacesuit perform this really critical work. We installed the International Docking Adapter to the front of Space Station. We retracted a radiator and reduced some of our risk for orbital debris. And one thing that folks may be really interested in is some high-definition cameras. So we can actually get some incredible views of the planet and the space station. So all these tasks were really important, and it's absolutely critical to execute that right. So you're balancing doing a perfect job and also looking at the planet through nothing but your visor and trying to just take it all in and think how amazing it is that you're floating in space, hanging on to the edge of the International Space Station.
Mm-hmm. Extraordinary. The space station now has been occupied continuously for 16 years, almost 16 years. Can you characterize for us, just in a nutshell, why is the space station still so important?
I think the simple one-sentence answer is this is the only laboratory where we can study microgravity is a variable. The other really unique thing about space station is the radiation environment. We can't perform some of these experiments on Earth. We have, for example, beams that will take a look at one specific heavy particle of radiation, but we can't simulate right now the complex radiation environment in low Earth orbit. As you get farther into space and are less protected by Earth's magnetic fields, you're subject to even more and more radiation. So it's interesting. It's interesting for NASA from a human health, performance, and exploration standpoint. It's really interesting for people on Earth because we are understanding and making new discoveries about fundamental biological, physical, material science aspects of things. Some of these experiments we just can't do on the planet. So this laboratory has been operated and staffed for an incredible number of years, and there is still an incredible number of years of work to do up here.
One last question. You'll be back on Earth soon. What are you most looking forward to?
Well, I'm really looking forward to landing, seeing the sun a little bit, feeling the feel of wind. There's a lot of things when you are not on the planet, you don't know that you would miss them. And when you suddenly move to a closed loop, completely, I would say, isolated environment, being on the planet sometimes sounds pretty good in terms of being able to experience even things like rain that you might take for granted and be annoyed that you're in a rainstorm. Think about astronauts who don't get rain for quite a few months. I think everything that feels like being outside sounds very appealing.
Station, this is Houston ACR. That concludes the KZSU Radio portion of the event. Please stand by for a voice check from NPR.
Station, this is Ray Bichelle with NPR. How do you hear me?
I've got you loud and clear. It's great to be talking to you today.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much. So I'm going to just fire off the questions here because we got 10 minutes. First one up, how many days have you been in space now? And you mentioned that you're floating. For people who can't see you where you are, what are you looking at right now?
So I've been in space. We have a party when we're in space for 100 days. Due to the timing of some of our launches down the road, we're actually having that party not at 100 days, but about 90 days. So we're coming up on 90 days soon. That's how I keep track of time up here. And I am floating right now. I mentioned that we're in free fall. So the space station is falling around the Earth. I'm falling with it. I can create some local acceleration here, but right now I'm floating in the middle of the U.S. laboratory, which is just about in the center of the space station and is really our nerve center. It's our epicenter for scientific investigations in this space station, which is, I have to say, enormous. I mean, it's the size of a 747. It's far bigger and more impressive than I expected in my years of working at NASA.
Gotcha. What moments during your time on the ISS have made you gasp out loud in surprise or wonder?
That is a great question because gasping out loud is actually the reaction you have quite a bit. There's a lot of things up here that you've just never seen in your human experience before. There's things that you know in theory, but have never actually witnessed. And when you encounter those kinds of phenomenon, it really just makes your jaw drop. So I'd never seen the aurora before. I'm from California, fairly low latitude, and never seen the aurora from the planet. So when I saw the aurora for the first time over the entire globe, I almost couldn't talk for a couple of minutes. It was so fantastic. I had a wonderful sighting the other day. Some very complicated rules about orbital motion and what beta angle you're at. But I was able to see the moon while we were on the space station. So we were in dark, and the moon was lit by the sun. I couldn't see the sun. The sun was on the other side of the planet. So it actually showed me planetary motion. Obviously, I've believe that Kepler is right, but to see that kind of thing really makes your jaw drop.
Okay. And can you tell me a little bit more about the heart cells, the stem cells that you grew? What was that like to do?
Yeah, absolutely. That was an experiment out of the cardiology lab at Stanford, and their goal was to use programmed adult stem cells, so iPS cells, that are adult cells that are then programmed to be heart cells, cardiomyocytes, and see if we could grow those on orbit, and how microgravity might affect the cellular organization, the structure, and the function. So part of it was a technical challenge. Can we launch cells into space, grow them in culture for a long period of time, and then return them to Earth? That was a pretty incredible experience. I've done a lot of cell culture in my life. There's something about seeing beating heart cells in space that was very inspiring, and I think really speaks to the scientific potential of space station as a laboratory.
I'm curious to know, how has being in space made you think differently about human bodies?
The physiology is incredibly changed up here, and that's a really interesting thing to see firsthand. So one of the things that changes is on the planet, when you're walking around in your daily life, all of your blood is drawn by the force of gravity down into your feet and your legs, and humans have evolved with this constant force of gravity. So that's how our physiology has evolved. When all of a sudden we build rockets and send people into space, which is quite unexpected from an evolutionary perspective, that fluid then shifts up to your head. So you actually lose a lot of your blood plasma volume. It's better in space to have slightly less blood volume. That's what homeostasis is up here. And you do get this feeling of head fullness, sort of like you're hanging upside down off the end of your bed, that never completely goes away. There's some really interesting effects that we're studying on arterial function. We have a slightly higher exposure to constant levels of CO2 up here, and we're living in a closed-loop environment, so we recycle all of our air and our water. All of those things have profound physiology effects, and we're participating in about 200 different experiments to analyze all of those effects on the human body.
Does it make you feel like your body is stronger or weaker than it felt on Earth?
Well, one of the things we get to do up here is weightlifting. So we can't actually lift weights. There's no weight here, just mass. We work against vacuum, and I have set a few records that are higher than I can lift on Earth. So I think overall the time we spend actually making sure astronauts stay healthy is an incredible contribution towards maintaining our physiology. And I would say right now I'm a little stronger in space than I am on the planet.
Okay, cool. So as a biologist on Earth, you were studying some really nasty viruses. What was motivating your work on Earth? And I'm interested to know, what drives you as a scientist in space now?
Yeah, so on Earth, I started out in undergraduate on HIV, actually, and was interested in that from a public health perspective at first, and then got very interested in the virology and where HIV integrates in the genome and potentially drugs to treat HIV infection. From there, I promised my mom I would work on a different virus, and unfortunately I chose Ebola and monkeypox and smallpox. The interest there is trying to understand how the virus and the human genome interact, what we might do to prevent future outbreaks. What is it about viruses that can come in and cause such lethal infections to humans? So we're obviously not working on any of those kinds of viruses up here on the space station, but the sorts of techniques that we would use, for example, the whole genome sequencing, any kind of PCR molecular techniques, looking at gene expression, looking at cellular structure, all of those are things that we use on the space station to try to understand a different variable here, and that is human physiology in space, cellular function and structure in microgravity, and the radiation effects on orbit.
So in all these experiments, I mean, understanding how medicine works in space, how heart cells hold up, who are you thinking in the back of your head will benefit from this? Is it people on Earth, or is it people who would be in the future living in space or on a planet like Mars?
I think the answer is both. These experiments, there's a lot of experiments here, obviously, that NASA does because they're interested in exploration. We're going beyond low Earth orbit. We have to start somewhere in terms of understanding what happens to human beings long-term in space. And we've been doing a lot of those experiments. There's a whole lot more left to learn. I'm surprised by the physiology every day.
Station, this is Houston ACR. That concludes the event. Thank you.